Okay, so let's look around a bit more. Here on the steering column, there is the stabilizer trim. These are two knobs. It's best to actually code this to a button if you have something like the honeycomb yoke or even the Cytec one. You should have switches that go up and down on the left side, and that's actually a very good one to program for the trim here. And as you can see, when I use this, then the trim wheel moves. So I would recommend to program that accordingly. Yeah, so lights, for the lighting, you can hide the yokes, but as I told you, I don't hide them because it's quite well done. Apart from the light switches, everything else is actually visible and accessible, and also the foot air and the windshield. I mean, they can be actually be pulled in and out, and I don't know what is simulated, and then you have the panel brightness and the lights. Okay, that's here, but that's the only things that get obstructed by the yoke. So the my normal flying view, and even this view here, the yokes are quite well done, so they're not really in the way. So I leave them on. Okay, so yeah, there's some memory dials. You can't really change them, but normally what you can do is, oops, you can in the real aircraft there are buttons here, and you could dial in your flight number basically, or something like that. This is sort of a memory device, as they call that. No. That's down here, and here's the that's the autopilot disengage button. I don't think this is coded here, but there is a Flyjsim command for it, and I would recommend that you use this. So if I turn on the autopilot now and I press that button, it turns off the autopilot. By the way, the autopilot is in two. There's an aileron and an elevator part of the autopilot, and there are separate switches, so you could individually activate the autopilot for lateral as well as vertical modes. So it's separated here, and you need to turn them on both, but they turn off together when you press that disengage button, which is here, but on my yoke obviously it's on the right side where I have a big red knob on the honeycomb yoke. Okay, so that's I think all I can show you here. Let's have a quick look through the actual instrument panel for the captain. You see here the autopilot light. If you want to have it stop blinking, you can click on it. When you click, when you hold it with the mouse, then you can test the lamp. There's another lights test possible by turning on the lights test here up into the test position, and that would give you all the lights everywhere, and that's what is used in real life to detect if there are any of the bulbs, any of the lights not working, which could be important to know, because you may not see a warning light coming on that you urgently need. Okay, so to turn this off, you just put the switch down again. This is an important switch if you run with SIVA INS or FMC. I have the FMC here, it's the X-plane FMC, you can also pop it out. When you want to do the LNAV thing, then you need to bring this into the GPS position. Otherwise you leave it in the nav position for the ILS landing, for example, or if you're actually flying along with radio navigation aids. Yeah, you have this in the nav position. Otherwise you switch it to GPS, and then it will follow the flight plan. Don't forget to switch at the end. I usually switch into heading mode, heading hold mode, with the heading already synchronized here. Then I turn off the GPS mode, bring it to nav, I have the ILS, for example, dialed in, and once the ILS is in, and if you do this shortly before you intercept your ILS, then you switch to nav here, and then to VOR lock or auto approach modes here on the autopilot, and then it will take over. But instead of getting its instructions from the FMC, it will actually use the navigation aid, in this case the ILS, for lateral and also vertical. Okay, you heard the telephone. It always rings when I need it the least. So let's continue. Here is the standby altimeter. These baro settings for the altimeters, they are actually separate as they are in real life, which can be a bit of a bummer, because when you have to change the baro setting here, you have to do it 3 times, co-pilot or first officer and captain. And so I've written myself a little script in Fly with Lua that synchronizes them all 3. But oh well, yeah. So what else have we got here? So this is the indicated airspeed, the ASI or airspeed indicator. What you can do here is you can set the speed with this bug. There is an autopilot mode called IAS. If you use the IAS mode, it will try and hold this particular speed here. So whatever you have dialed in here as a speed, it will hold it. There is no auto throttle, don't forget, which means that you control the vertical speed for climb or descent, depends. So if you want to climb, for example, with 250 knots from one altitude to another, you can activate the IAS mode, and it will then pitch up in order to acquire and hold then the speed that you have dialed in. These bugs can be moved, so it is a bit explainish the way they do this, okay, but I've showed you before that for takeoff you can actually click set bugs, and it will set up V1 is 138, rotation is 139. This is actually very close every time here, okay, and V2 is 146. Now V2 is not going to be bugged, but they put in speeds. I have to check what these 2 are, okay, but they're probably around flap retraction and things like that. Yeah, so this is 200, 210, it's a bit over 220, so that would probably be the speed that we are flying out. This is V1 here. Okay, so when we reach this, and this is always quite low, this bug. I suppose you could use it, and if you want, you can actually put V2, so it's 146. So you would put this, let's say, up here, and then you could. Whoops. Yeah, they're very sensitive. You could basically put up V1 here, but as I say, it's quite fiddly. And then you could put V2 here or something like that. But it's not really necessary. These are usually about 6 to 7 knots apart from each other. No point having 2 bugs, so I keep it with this setting, and I'll rotate in and around reaching this speed bug. This is the radio magnetic indicator, RMI. Again, if you have dialed in frequencies for VORs or ADFs that are actually in reach, depending on your setting, one of the 2 arrows will start following this. This is direction finder basically, so it will point towards the radio navigation aid and gives you an idea of where it is in relation to your position. This is the ADI, the attitude indicator here. The test button doesn't work, and it will give you a flight director when it's turned on. At the moment, I don't think we have it turned on. Quickly put this away and check. So at the moment, flight director is off. So if you put it into one of those flight director modes, this is by the way the switch. It's not just on off. You actually have to select the mode in which you want the flight director to work. So we currently have the lateral mode of heading, and because the way the aircraft is orientated at the moment and the heading, which can be put in down here, differ. So the flight director basically points to how you need to set the aircraft to achieve this heading. If I change the heading a bit, you see now the flight director kind of levels off because we are now in that selected heading mode. This here is a speed deviation indicator. So basically if I put in 250, it will indicate whether you're too fast or too slow. So because we are extremely away from the dialed in speed, let me see if we can make this move so that you can see it. Probably not. Nah, yeah, you can't bring it down close enough. So let's show this in flight then. But basically, when you are near the speed that you have set up here, then this arrow will come down, and when it's exactly in the middle, you are on your speed, on the required speed, or you're too slow or you're too high. Okay, one of the two. This is actually a fine area, so it's far too much difference here. So we were talking about 10 or 20 knots or something like that per dot. It's something like 10 or 5 knots per dot. So it's a relatively small scale. Yeah. Okay, so it's just a normal ADI that you have also in many other planes. There's nothing special about it. It's just not an electronic one with a screen. It is a hardware one. This up here is, and you can push to cancel any of these modes. This is a mode instrument comparator, and it actually checks if there are differences between the instruments on the first officer side and the captain side. And if there is a difference, it will bring up a yellow light indicating that you have that they don't match somehow. Okay, let's continue. That down here is the HSI, horizontal situation indicator. You basically have your course. That's like with any other navigation instrument. Yeah, doesn't matter whether it's on a screen or if it's like hardware like this here. This is the vertical deviation for the glide slope, for example. So it indicates that we are below the glide slope. And this is the heading, and this is actually coupled with the autopilot. So if you are in heading mode, turning this little knob and changing this marker here to another heading will trigger, as you can see here now, it has triggered already a flight director movement. And if the autopilot is linked in lateral mode, it will actually start following the flight director, and it will in this case turn towards the right. So that's the course that you need to set up if you're flying towards a radio navigation aid, as you should know from other aircraft as well. This is also in a Cessna, so this is not different to what you normally have on any of the airplanes. The only difference is that if you're in GPS mode, the course you cannot change it anymore. Okay, it's decoupled from the knob here because the FMC or the CIVA INS will calculate the required course, and it will set it up there automatically. If you have a radio navigation aid which happens to have a distance measuring equipment, as that's called, and we seem to have one here because it says distance to the navigation aid is 1 mile. Okay, so this will increase or decrease depending or not whether you fly towards a radio navigation aid or away from it. Most navigation aids do have a distance measuring equipment or a distance signal, basically, so that the DME can be determined. Distance measuring equipment. It's not the navigation aid that has a DME; it's the airplane actually who has a DME. Here's one for the second navigation radio. You see we have two of them here. That's nav 1, that's nav 2. So here you see the distance to something that is already dialed in on nav 2. If I change the frequency, we probably see this change, because now we don't have reception. If I change the frequency back, you can see that you have 64 miles distance. Yeah, that's about what I can tell you about the HSI. So it's the main navigation instrument for lateral navigation. Then we have the normal altimeter with the baro setting. You need to put this to the QNH value according to what ATC gives you or the weather report says. Sometimes there's also an altitude bug here, but this aircraft doesn't have that. And this is the vertical speed indicator, the VSI. Now there are two ways you can actually switch this. If you go to the options window and you can turn this off, then you get a classic clock instrument here without any TCAS information. But again, we are in modern times. We use an old aircraft in modern times, so we have it upgraded a little bit. And in this case, we have it upgraded with a little screen here that shows you the vertical speed and also allows you to have a TCAS indicator, and you can even change the range. Okay, so if there are, and you can do the brightness here. So if there are aircraft in the vicinity below or above a maximum number of feet, then you will see them indicated here, and you will also see if there are any potential collisions. It's TCAS means traffic collision avoidance system, and that's what this is all about. At the moment, the TCAS is in standby mode. Right, so this is the radio altimeter, a very classic one, which basically sends out a radio signal, or a radar signal, so to say, towards the ground, and the radar signal comes back, is reflected, and if it can measure the time, and by taking the time between having sent out the signal and receiving it back, it can determine how fast or how far it has traveled, and that is the altitude over the ground. So this radio altimeter will give you the exact altitude above ground, AGL, ground level, AGL, and that is used for landing, and it only works below 2,500 feet. So as soon as you are lower than 2,500 feet above the ground, that's not necessarily what you see here on the altimeter. That depends on your pressure settings, baro settings here. It will then start to move, and the further down you get, the lower the value, or the needle will then turn anti-clockwise to 0. So that's the radio altimeter. We have minimum call outs and stuff like that enabled. That's an option here of this aircraft. If you, I think it's the call outs, yeah, here it is. So you have call outs enabled, and that will also give you, for example, 200 as kind of a minimum call. Yeah, and that is the very sophisticated fancy clock. Yeah, there isn't really much you can do. There's no stopwatch, no nothing. So if you want to fly by the clock, you better get yourself some stopwatch on the handy, on the mobile or something like that. Yeah. Okay, let's look up here. These lights are for the landing system. You have the inner, outer, and middle marker, and that's the three indicators, there are also sound. You can have marker sound, but they're mainly indicated by light. So depending on the color, you know that you're on the outer, inner, or middle marker. Okay, so that's that. And this here is your, yeah, how would you call that? The kind of a mode, the autopilot mode selector, or something like that. Or well, hang on, there was a name for that. It's approach progress display. That's what it's called. Yeah, approach progress display. Because the idea is that you can you set up your autopilot into a specific mode, and you see the flight director and the autopilot are actually in separate columns, because in this aircraft, flight director and autopilot are two distinguished systems. They may also be in modern aircraft, but they are highly integrated in modern aircraft. So although they may be separate systems technically, they are integrated as such that there is no difference. So usually when you activate the autopilot, the flight director modes are in sync, depending on what you set up here. Here you will need to set up the mode of the flight director independently of the autopilot. That is different to what you're used to in the ZIBO and so on. Okay, and that's why there are two columns here, and it shows you basically navlock. That's when you have activated the navlock mode on the flight director. There's also a navlock mode on the autopilot. When these two are on, then you're not only seeing it, but you're also flying it, basically. The glide slope mode, there are also different colors if it's still acquiring. If it's still acquiring the mode, okay. Amber colored means armed. Green, as you see here, heading means captured. And I wonder what happens if I move this further out. Yeah. Well, no, nothing changes at the moment. Yeah. So here you can see if you do the test, you can see that there are also amber lights, and that means the mode is armed. Okay, and green means it is. There's a go around mode, but that's not for the throttle. That's actually only for I guess the flight director showing you the respective go around attitude in order for you to then follow it and climb through. And the GPS mode, I guess, is when we are slave to the GPS. Yeah. So that's the approach progress display. To go back to this light here, that thing is called instrument comparator lights, and they always light up when there is a discrepancy there's a certain tolerance, but if the instruments on both sides, any of these will differ significantly, then these will go on, and that just gives you an idea that something wrong either with the instruments themselves or maybe with some other settings. For example, the co-pilot has forgotten to set up the correct barometric altitude or something like that, and that means it gets a different indication. Or if there's a problem with the pitot tubes and the indicated airspeeds differ significantly from each other, that is when you would get the appropriate lamp to go on. Altimeter is the same thing. Yeah. So that's it. And when we have a very, very quick look at the first officer side, you will see it's very, very similar. There's not much difference between these two. Yeah. By the way, the MDA light, I haven't shown that yet. That means mean decision altitude annunciator. So basically, if your decision altitude has been reached, these MDA lights will come on. There's also another indicator here at the radio altimeter. I don't think I have covered that. And that's the autopilot disengage light. We have seen this before. So when the autopilot gets disengaged, this starts blinking, and You can stop the blinking if it hasn't stopped by just pressing it, or you can test the button as you can test any button individually by just clicking on it. Okay. So the rest is the same, the clocks, the HSI. Here the difference is that the HSI on this side will give you the distance to VOR2. And this will give you VOR1, whereas when you're on the captain's side it's the other way around. That means here the nav receiver 1 will show its distance and the nav receiver 2 will show you here, as we've seen before. Otherwise, very similar. The RMI is the same, the altimeter is the same. Again, here too, the flight director modes and the autopilot modes. That's the total air temperature, the TAT, total air temperature. At the moment we are at 15 degrees. Its indicator, that's only on the first officer side, and also the pressure gauges. So we have hydraulic brake pressure in the yellow. So at the moment we are not producing, we don't have any pumps on. This is probably in the so-called accumulator or something similar, which accumulates or stores pressure. There are two systems here, so you can see one of the two is completely empty, and the other one has some pressure on it, and that's the hydraulic fluid quantity in gallons. And yeah, so I think we are fine here when it comes to this. If the quantity is low, and I could imagine if we have the maintenance mode turned on, could very well happen that we are getting slowly but surely that the hydraulic fluid quantity will decrease, and at some point we could even face a low quantity if we haven't checked before flight. You also have some panel lights here, same thing, so it's all very similar. Here these lights, it's the same, and the same also with the instrument comparator, because same stuff. Here's the pull-up light, below glide slope indicator, altitude alert, that come about 1,000 feet before you reach your selected altitude. You have got the same stuff here, by the way. So these same indicators are also on the captain's side. Okay, so that's it. That's the normal flight panel for the captain and the first officer. And next we are going to look at the other parts of the front panel.